That morning I thought I'd discovered the worst of it. My wife had been hiding an affair, and it was with my brother, David, the golden child, the family's beloved. But as I sat there in stunned silence, watching her face as she confessed, she dropped one final bombshell. Our son, the little boy I'd loved, raised, and protected from the world, might not even be mine. In that moment, I knew that the life I thought I'd built was a lie, and if they wanted war, I was ready to give it to them. They say family is your sanctuary, the one place where you'll always belong. But for me, family felt more like a cage, a twisted, heavy burden I'd spent my life carrying. My younger brother, David, was the golden child, adored by our parents from the day he was born. Charming, smart, quick with his words, he was everything our parents could have wanted. I, on the other hand, was quiet, serious, and never quite able to shine in the same effortless way he did. Growing up, David was allowed every privilege and every pass. Our parents overlooked his flaws, brushed aside his mistakes, and covered for him when he crossed the line. My role was simple: keep things together, be responsible, smooth over David's chaos. I accepted this partly out of duty, partly because I didn't know any other way. But it left me feeling empty and resentful, and I dreamed of a life where I could finally be free of my family's hold. When I left for college, I thought that distance would be enough. I even managed to avoid David for a few years, and in that time I met Karen. She was bright and warm, the exact opposite of everything I'd come to know in my family. She made me believe I could have a different kind of life, one filled with honesty and love instead of bitterness and rivalry. We married not long after graduating and had a son, Oliver, soon after. I thought I'd finally built a sanctuary of my own, a life where David couldn't reach me. But Karen, always the optimist, insisted that family was important. Oliver deserves to know his uncle, she'd said. He deserves to have a connection with his family. I disagreed, but she was persistent. Reluctantly, I agreed to let David back into my life, hoping, foolishly, that maybe he'd grown up. David hadn't changed. Not in the slightest. The warning signs started out small, subtle enough that they were easy to dismiss. David would show up unannounced, inserting himself into our family events, often drawing Karen into long conversations that seemed just a bit too personal. He'd make little comments that were sharp-edged, things like, "Oh, Karen, you deserve more than being stuck at home all day," or, "Why don't you come out with me tonight? You need a break from the domestic life." He knew exactly how to push my buttons, but I tried to brush it off, focusing on work and my time with Oliver. Then one night, Karen came home late after a supposed night out with friends. She seemed flustered, distant, her usual warmth dimmed. I asked her if everything was okay, and she waved it off, saying she was just tired. But I could sense something shifting, something I couldn't quite grasp. The next few weeks felt like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. Karen started staying out later, claiming she needed time to herself, while David showed up more frequently, acting as though he was part of our daily lives. One evening, I returned home from work, expecting to see Karen and Oliver, but found the house quiet. Oliver was at a friend's house, and Karen was sitting alone in the living room, staring at the floor. I closed the door, a feeling of dread settling over me. "We need to talk," she said softly, not looking up. The way she said it, the crack in her voice, the way her shoulders slumped, made my heart drop. I took a seat across from her, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "It's about David," she began, her voice barely a whisper. My blood ran cold. I didn't need her to say more, but she did anyway, the words falling out of her like stones. "David and we've been seeing each other." Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear. It just happened." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind scrambling to process what I was hearing. My own brother, Karen, the woman I trusted more than anyone. How long had they been lying to me? How long had they been carrying on this betrayal right under my nose? How long? I managed to ask, my voice flat, hollow. "A few months?" she admitted, her face twisted with shame. I tried to stop it, I did. But But you didn't, I finished, the words coming out sharper than I intended. I wanted to scream, to break something, to rage against the betrayal that had invaded my life. But I sat frozen, numb, watching the life I'd built crumble around me. And then, as if her confession wasn't enough to shatter me, she added, "There's more, Oliver. He might not be yours." The words struck me like a physical blow. I felt like I'd been punched, like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Oliver, my son, my world, the boy I'd raised and loved with everything I had. She was telling me he might not even be mine? You're saying David could be his father? I forced the words out, barely able to believe what I was hearing. She nodded, her face a mask of guilt and regret. But all I could feel was a consuming rage, a darkness settling over me that I'd never felt before. I stood up, unable to stay in that room a moment longer. Without another word, I left the house, slamming the door behind me. I got into my car and drove, the streets blurring as I sped away, the pain and anger swirling inside me, making it hard to breathe. All I could think about was David, his smug face, his constant need to take everything that mattered to me. That night, I drove for hours, finally ending up on the outskirts of town, parked at an empty overlook. I stared into the darkness, my mind racing. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. I knew David well enough to understand that he wouldn't just walk away. He'd found a way into my life, into my family, and he'd do anything to hold on to his grip. I picked up my phone and called Josh, a close friend from college who had become a family lawyer. I told him everything, every painful, humiliating detail. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he spoke in a calm, steady voice that grounded me. "You need proof," he said. "If you're going to fight this, you need solid evidence. Otherwise, David will twist this against you. And from what you've told me, he won't hesitate to use whatever leverage he can find." The idea of a custody battle tore at me. The thought of David being in Oliver's life, of him manipulating and controlling my son, was a nightmare I couldn't accept. But I knew Josh was right. I couldn't rely on anger alone. I needed facts. The next day, I hired a private investigator. I wanted every detail of David's involvement with Karen, every sordid piece of evidence that could expose him for what he really was. If he thought he could destroy my family, he was about to learn that I wouldn't go down without a fight. The following weeks were a blur of tense, silent encounters with Karen and restless nights lying awake, haunted by the life I thought I'd had. Each day felt like a battle as I went through the motions, pretending things were normal for Oliver's sake, trying to shield him from the chaos he couldn't possibly understand. Karen stayed, though our marriage was a fragile, broken shell of what it once was. She'd look at me sometimes with those sad, remorseful eyes, as if hoping for forgiveness. But I couldn't bring myself to even speak to her outside of what was necessary for Oliver. Meanwhile, David's presence grew bolder. He'd show up at family gatherings, a smug smile on his face, acting as though nothing had happened. He'd joke with Karen in front of everyone, casting quick, arrogant glances in my direction as if daring me to react. And every time, I had to grit my teeth and force myself to remain silent, to keep the anger under control, knowing that soon, I'd have everything I needed to make him pay. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the investigator called me into his office. "I have something you need to see," he said, his voice serious. When I arrived, he handed me a folder. Inside were photos of David and Karen together, their betrayal laid out in cold, undeniable proof. But that wasn't all. There was one more piece of evidence, a DNA test that showed a high probability that Oliver was not biologically mine. I sat there, staring at the paper, my hands shaking. Oliver, my son, the boy I'd loved, protected, and raised, might not even be mine. My entire life felt like a lie, a cruel joke orchestrated by the brother I had tried to escape my entire life. "What do you want to do next?" the investigator asked, his voice heavy with sympathy. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm going to confront them, both of them." That night, I returned home with the folder in hand. I called Karen and David, demanding they come over. David tried to brush me off, as if this was nothing but an inconvenience to him, but I insisted. If they wanted to ruin my life, I was going to make them face the consequences. When they arrived, we sat in the living room, a tense silence filling the space. I laid the folder on the table between us and watched as they both looked down, the color draining from Karen's face as she realized what I had. "It's over," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I know everything." David's smirk faltered, but he quickly regained his composure, leaning back with that familiar arrogance. "What are you going to do? You're just wasting your time." But he was wrong. This time, I wasn't going to let him win. David's smug look didn't waver, but there was a tension in his face that told me he was caught off guard. That maybe, just maybe, he hadn't anticipated me fighting back. Karen sat frozen, her eyes wide as she glanced from the folder to me, as if she couldn't believe I'd actually done this. But after all the lies, the betrayal, the shattered life they'd left me with, this confrontation was long overdue. "So now you know," David finally said, shrugging. "But let's be real, what's the point? You're overreacting. You think you can just sweep this all away with some moral high ground?" I looked at him, anger surging in waves. "Overreacting? You betrayed me, David. You didn't just take my wife, you took everything. My son. My family." I fought to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the raw pain in my own words. Karen looked down, her face pale, her expression a mess of guilt and shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I turned to her, the frustration and anger boiling over. "What did you think was going to happen, Karen? You kept a lie for years. You used me." She didn't answer, and for the first time she looked utterly broken. I could tell she hadn't expected it to end like this. Maybe she thought I'd never find out, that I'd simply play along, oblivious. But David leaned in, his tone cold and dismissive. "So what are you going to do? Drag this all to court? Good luck. The judge isn't going to care about a little family drama." He put air quotes around the words, as though this were all some trivial dispute. "You're wrong," I said, my voice hardening. "This isn't just family drama. This is about Oliver. And I'm going to fight for him." David smirked. "Oliver's not your son, and deep down, you know it. He deserves to be with his real father." It took everything in me not to lunge at him. The idea that he thought he could simply take over, that he'd just decide he was ready to be a father after all these years, made my blood boil. But I held myself back, channeling every bit of anger into determination. "You think he's yours, just because of a DNA test?" I asked, holding his gaze. "Being a father isn't about biology, David. I'm the one who's been there for him, who's raised him. You can't just swoop in and take him." David's smirk faded for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "And what about Karen?" he said, regaining his composure. "Think she'll want you around when she could have me?" For the first time, Karen looked up, and there was something in her expression I hadn't expected. A deep, lingering regret. She glanced between us, as though seeing us both for who we truly were, as though she realized just how far things had spiraled out of her control. "Stop it, David," she said quietly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a strength in it I hadn't seen before. David turned to her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Excuse me? Stop this," she repeated, her gaze firm. "This isn't about what I want or what you want. This is about Oliver. And he deserves better than all of this." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw David's confidence crack. He'd come here expecting to win, to trample over whatever defenses I put up, but he hadn't expected Karen to push back. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his tone edged with anger. "I'm saying I'm done," Karen replied, her voice steady now. "I'm done with you, with all of this. I don't want to hurt Oliver. And right now, he needs stability. He needs his father." She looked at me, a flicker of apology in her eyes. "And that's you." I felt a strange, unexpected surge of relief. It wasn't forgiveness. I couldn't forgive her for what she'd done. Not yet, maybe not ever. But knowing that she wouldn't fight me for Oliver, that she was willing to step back, was more than I'd hoped for. David, however, was furious. "You're kidding me," he spat. "After everything we've been through, you're choosing him?" Karen's expression softened, but her voice was firm. "This isn't a choice between you and him, David. This is a choice for Oliver." She glanced at me again. "And I'm not going to take Oliver away from the only father he's ever known." David scoffed, standing up, his eyes flashing with anger. "Fine," he snapped. "You two can play happy family if you want. But don't think for a second this is over. I'll get Oliver back, one way or another." He stormed out, leaving Karen and me in a silence thick with tension. I could feel the weight of the past months settling over us, the shattered trust, the lies, the pain. But there was also a strange kind of understanding, a recognition that whatever came next we'd have to rebuild, for Oliver's sake if not for our own. After David left, Karen and I sat in silence for a long time. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look up. My mind was still racing, the anger, hurt, and relief all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't fix that, but I want you to know. I want to be a better mother to Oliver." I looked up, meeting her gaze. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman who'd brought light and warmth into my life. But she was different now, her face shadowed with regret and guilt. "You have a lot to make up for?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's not going to be that easy." She nodded, accepting my words without protest. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I want to do what's right for Oliver, even if that means stepping back and letting you take the lead." The weight of her words settled over me, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to coexist for Oliver's sake. It wouldn't be easy, and it would never be the same, but if it meant giving Oliver the stability he needed, I'd be willing to try. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Josh to prepare for the custody hearing. Karen agreed to back me, to formally support my claim as Oliver's primary guardian. She moved into a small apartment across town, visiting Oliver regularly but respecting the boundaries we'd set. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was manageable. And slowly, I began to feel a glimmer of hope that Oliver might come out of this without losing too much of the life he knew. But David wasn't done. One afternoon, as I was picking up Oliver from school, I noticed David's car parked nearby. He was standing by the entrance, watching the children as they streamed out, his gaze intense. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was waiting for Oliver. I walked over to him, keeping my voice low, not wanting to create a scene. "What are you doing here, David?" He looked at me with that same smug smile, though there was something darker in his eyes now, something that hinted at desperation. "Just seeing my son," he said, his tone light, but there was a venom behind it. "He's not your son," I replied, my voice hard, "and you need to stay away from him." David laughed, shaking his head. "You really think you can just shut me out? I have rights, you know. I have a claim." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "The court will decide that. Until then, stay away from him, David. I'm warning you." He leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "Or what? You can't stop me from seeing him. And believe me, I'm not going anywhere." I stepped back, keeping my voice steady. "You've done enough damage, David. You think this is about winning? It's not. This is about Oliver. And you don't deserve to be a part of his life." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Anger, frustration, perhaps even fear. But he quickly masked it with a sneer. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning and walking away. The encounter shook me. I knew David was manipulative, but this was different. There was a desperation to his actions now, as if he was grasping at anything to keep control. I realized that he wasn't just trying to hurt me. He wanted to claim Oliver as his, to take everything I had left. The next day, Josh called with urgent news. David had filed for visitation rights, claiming he was Oliver's biological father and had a right to be involved in his life. The move was bold, but not entirely unexpected. David had always believed he could get what he wanted by pushing boundaries, by taking without asking. But I wasn't going to let him win this time. Josh reassured me that we had a strong case, especially with Karen's support, but the stakes had never felt higher. This wasn't just a battle for custody. It was a battle for my son's future, for the life I'd built, for everything I cared about. As I sat in my living room that evening, Oliver playing quietly beside me, I felt a wave of determination wash over me. David could try every trick, every manipulation he knew, but I wouldn't back down. Not this time. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let David dictate the terms. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and I woke up early, too anxious to sleep. Oliver was with Karen for the morning, and I spent the quiet hours before the hearing going over my statement, every word carefully planned with Josh's help. This wasn't just a court appearance. It was a battle for everything that mattered to me. When I arrived at the courthouse, Karen was already there, looking nervous but resolute. She met my eyes and nodded, a silent reassurance that she was on my side. David, on the other hand, stood with his lawyer, smirking, looking far too comfortable for a man who'd done so much damage. He was acting like he'd already won, like this was just another game. As we entered the courtroom, I forced myself to stay calm, to remember that I was here for Oliver. It didn't matter what David thought or what he planned. I just needed to prove to the court that I was the father Oliver deserved, that I could give him the stability and love he needed. The hearing began, and the judge listened as our lawyers presented the case. Josh spoke first, laying out the facts clearly, emphasizing my role in Oliver's life, my dedication as his father. He brought up the years of care, the memories, the countless moments that had defined my bond with my son. I watched the judge's expression, noting the small nods, the glances in my direction as Josh explained what I'd sacrificed, what I'd built for Oliver. Then came David's turn. His lawyer argued that, as Oliver's biological father, David had a natural right to be involved in his life. They painted a picture of David as the overlooked parent, the one who'd been pushed away and denied a relationship with his real son. David, ever the actor, played his part perfectly, casting quick, remorseful glances toward me and Karen, as though he were the victim of some great injustice. Karen was called to the stand. She took a deep breath, and though she looked nervous, there was a determination in her voice as she answered each question. She admitted her mistakes openly, her regrets over the affair, but she made one thing very clear. She believed that Oliver belonged with me. She described my dedication as a father, the way I'd put Oliver's needs above everything, the life I'd built for him. David sat there, his jaw tightening with each word, as she praised the family environment I'd created for Oliver. After she finished, the judge called me up. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. David's gaze bore into me, daring me to make my case. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "I may not be Oliver's biological father, but I am the only father he's ever known. I've been there every single day of his life, through every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every birthday and every bad dream. I love him like he's my own because to me, he is my own." I paused, glancing briefly at David, who was watching me with a hard, resentful stare. "Blood may be part of family, but it's not the whole story," I continued. "What defines a family is the love, the dedication, the time you give. And I've given everything I have to Oliver. I ask you to consider what's best for him, not based on biology, but on who's been there for him, who has his best interests at heart." I stepped down, my heart pounding, hoping that my words had struck the judge as deeply as they felt to me. After hours of statements and deliberations, the judge returned with a decision. The room was thick with tension as we all waited, bracing ourselves. "In the matter of Oliver Benson," the judge began, "I have carefully considered all evidence and testimony. While Mr. David Benson has claimed biological paternity, this court believes that the best interests of the child must be considered above all else." She looked directly at David, then at me, her expression firm. "The evidence shows that Oliver has been raised with stability, care, and love by Mr. Andrew Benson, who has been his primary caregiver since birth. Therefore, This court grants full custody of Oliver to Mr. Andrew Benson, with supervised visitation for Mr. David Benson. A wave of relief washed over me, so overwhelming that I could hardly breathe. I'd won. Oliver was safe, he would stay with me. I felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifting. David's face twisted in fury. He started to stand, to argue, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, holding him back. For the first time, I saw a hint of panic in his eyes, a realization that he'd lost control, that the judge's decision was final. Karen reached over and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet sincerity. "Thank you for fighting for him, for being the father he deserves." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. This wasn't the ending I'd wanted when we'd started this family, but it was the one that would protect Oliver. And that was all that mattered. After the hearing, David made one last attempt to confront me outside the courthouse. He stormed up to me, his face contorted with anger, his voice barely controlled. "This isn't over," he hissed. "I'll find a way to get him back. You think you can just take him from me?" I met his gaze unflinching. "It's over, David. You tried to destroy everything I built, and you failed. You have no claim to Oliver. And if you try to come near him again, you'll answer to the law." For the first time, David seemed to falter. He looked at me, a flicker of desperation in his eyes, as if he were finally realizing the depth of what he'd lost. But I didn't feel pity. He'd made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the cold light of the courthouse steps. For the first time, I felt free, truly free, from his grasp. The days that followed were a blur of relief and adjustment. Karen and I began co-parenting more smoothly, finding a rhythm that worked for Oliver's sake. She kept her distance, respecting the boundaries we'd set, but she was present when it mattered. I could see that she was making an effort to be a better mother, and though our relationship was beyond repair, I was grateful for the steps she was taking for Oliver. One evening, as I was putting Oliver to bed, he looked up at me with his bright, curious eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice soft, "are we going to be okay?" I felt a surge of emotion, and I nodded, ruffling his hair. "Yes, buddy, we're going to be okay. I promise." He smiled, content with my answer, and I tucked him in, feeling a peace I hadn't known in months. For all the chaos, all the pain, I'd managed to protect the most important part of my life. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Over the following months, life began to settle into something that felt stable, something that felt real. I started to let go of the resentment, the bitterness that David and Karen had left behind. There were days when it was still hard, when the memories resurfaced, but each time I looked at Oliver, I was reminded of what I'd fought for. One afternoon, as we were playing in the backyard, Oliver looked up at me with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," he said, "you're my real dad, right?" I felt my heart tighten, and I knelt down, meeting his gaze. "Yes, Oliver, I'm your dad. That will never change." He smiled, his small hand reaching up to hold mine, and in that moment, I knew that I'd won something far more important than any court case. I'd built a bond that went beyond biology, beyond betrayal, a bond that no one could ever take from us. As I stood there, holding his hand, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a sense of peace and purpose. This was my family, imperfect as it was, and I would protect it with everything I had. David's shadow no longer loomed over us. We were finally free.